Okay, moving on to February. February, page 130. You can see it, 130 in my book. Wednesday Wars by Gary Schmidt. So 130, chapter February. So chapter January, right? Remember we talked about how Holling has some disaster. Every chapter, there's something huge that happens to him. But in this one, in January, it felt like it kind of resolved, right? Even in December, right? We had that horrible thing with Mickey Mantle, but then he gets to meet the other Yankees players. So there's always this fight, right? So we talked about Tragedy of Macbeth in January. That was the play that he read about vengeance and somebody doing something that just feels like it ruins you. But in the end, it all works out. And vengeance is over. The person who caused the problem is gone, right? In the play, he's dead, he's beheaded. But in the chapter, it seems, we don't know who put the new pictures up, but you wonder, because of where they all were, if it was Doug Switek's brother who is fixing what he screwed up. Or maybe it was Doug, or maybe it was Merrill Lee, who knows, right? But somebody made right what had really kind of ruined Holling's beginning of the year. And sister doesn't die by getting hit by a bus. Instead, Holling's rear end does. So February is the chapter we're going to go through, hopefully without interruptions from my clippy dog. You can hear him walking sometimes. But February, we'll find out a new play that he gets to read and some new things. On the first Friday of February, my father missed Walter Cronkite on the CBS Evening News because he was spending most of the whole day getting ready for the formal presentation of the Chamber of Commerce Businessman of 1967 Award at the Kiwanis Club that night. Actually, we were all spending a lot of time getting ready for the Kiwanis Club because my mother and sister were wearing long gowns, and my father and I were wearing tuxedos, which are uncomfortable and don't fit right and come with shoes made for people with very wide feet. My sister had used most of the getting ready time to complain, especially about the stupid purple orchid that the Kiwanis Club had sent, which she had to pin to her shoulder. And it didn't help when I pointed out that I had to wear a white carnation in my lapel, that little folded part of your coat, right? Lapel. And that wearing a purple orchid wasn't nearly as bad. And it really didn't help when I pointed out that I had to wear white feathers on my butt and that wearing a purple orchid really wasn't as bad as that. And it really, really didn't help that when my father pointed out she had always wanted to be a flower child, so here was her chance. "You don't take anything I believe seriously, do you?" she said to him. "Tie your hair back from your face." She went upstairs to the bathroom to tie her hair back from her face. I went up after her. "You should take the orchid and flush it down the toilet," I said. And she looked at me. "Why don't you take your carnation and flush it down the toilet?" "Maybe I will." She pointed to the toilet. "Go ahead." But I didn't have to flush my carnation down the toilet because right then a whole series of low chords sounded from the piano in the perfect living room below us, followed by a roar and a crash as the entire newly plastered ceiling fell, smashing down the top of the baby grand piano, ripping the plastic seat cushions, flattening the fake tropical flowers, tearing the gleaming mirror from the wall, and spreading its glittering shards across the floor, where they mixed with the dank, wet plaster that immediately began to settle into the carpet to stain it forever. All four of us stood in the hall, the thick, sickly smell of mold in our nostrils. If the committee that chose the Chamber of Commerce Businessman of 1967 heard what my father had to say about the carpenters and plasterers who had come to fix our living room ceiling, they might not have given him the award, since one of the requirements was the nominee had to support the general business atmosphere of the town. And my red-faced father was hollering and swearing about how he was going to decrease the number of town's businesses by 2. And he was shredding his white carnation as he said this, which is probably why Shylock would have done if he'd been wearing a white carnation after being cheated out of his ducats. If you remember, that was from Merchant of Venice. It was a good thing that neither the carpenters nor the plasterers were at the Kiwanis Club that night. We drove there in silence, and just before we walked into the club, I took off my carnation and handed it to my father. He took it without a word while my mother pinned it to his lapel. I held my flowerless lapel out to my sister and smirked. She smiled back very sweetly. Then as soon as we'd gotten inside, she excused herself, went into the ladies' room, and came back without her orchid. She was still smiling sweetly when she leaned down to me and whispered, down the toilet, you little jerk." So we were both flowerless, and we went into the reception hall, but no one would have seen the flowers anyway since the hall was so dark. The only light came from the candles on the table, the lit end of cigarettes, and the lamps at the head table, which shone off the fake paneling on the wall behind. My father sat up there. The rest of us sat below him at a center table with the wives of the Kiwanis Club officers. My mother refused and offered cigarette. I could tell this wasn't easy. And then she chattered to the Kiwanis wives while my sister and I sat silently through the dinner, roast beef and mashed potatoes and buttered lima beans. Through dessert, lemon meringue pie with a whole lot more meringue than lemon, and through the opening greetings and speeches, and then through my father's speech of grateful acceptance. He was still red in the face when he got up to speak. You could tell he was looking out at the audience for the carpenters and plasterers. But he made it through without hollering and swearing, and everyone clapped when he talked about the growing business opportunities of the town, and how he was glad to be a part of it all, and how someday he hoped to leave a thriving, prosperous business and a thriving, prosperous town to his son to carry on the good name of Hood and Associates. Lots of clapping at this. When everyone at the head table looked down at me, I smiled and nodded like I was supposed to, since I'm the son who's going to inherit Hood and Associates. My sister kicked me under the table. Toads, beetles, bats. When we got home that night, my father phoned the carpenters and plasterers, and he told them that he didn't care it was late on a Friday night, and he didn't care that tomorrow was Saturday, that they had better be at the house first thing in the morning, ready to fix the ceiling permanently and to offer restitution for the property damage for their carelessness had caused. They were there first thing in the morning. If I had anything to say about it, which of course I didn't, I would have had the carpenters and plasterers head over to Camillo Junior High as soon as they were done with the perfect living room, because the ceiling in our classroom was getting to be a bigger and bigger problem as the weeks went by, and Mr. Goreshi and Mr. Van Leary couldn't trap, poison, snag, snare, net, corner, maim, coax, or convince the rats to give themselves up. 8 asbestos ceiling tiles had started to bulge down. You can picture like the ceilings in the classrooms that we have, those square kind of foamy looking tiles, those same kind of things. So 8 of them starting to bulge, which meant either Sycorax and Caliban were getting fatter or the ceiling was getting weaker. Every morning, Mrs. Baker looked up at the bulges to inspect them, and every morning she looked a little more nervous. So suppose she looks up there and sees that they've chewed a hole in the tiles and they're looking back at her. What happens then? I said to Danny. You know the sound the bus driver made just before she hit you? I remembered the sound. It wasn't anything compared to what Mrs. Baker would do. We waited hopefully, but the 8 bulging tiles stayed intact. At the beginning of February, Mrs. Baker assigned me Romeo and Juliet. I read it in 3 nights. Let me tell you, these 2 wouldn't make it very far in Camillo Junior High. Never mind that Romeo wears tights, at least according to the pictures. But he just isn't very smart. And Juliet isn't too strong in that department either. I mean, a potion to almost kill you. She drinks a potion to almost kill you. Who would drink a potion to almost kill you? Then Romeo goes ahead and drinks a potion that will kill you because he can't figure out that she only had a potion to almost kill you. And then Juliet, who's at least smart enough to figure out that Romeo really is dead, makes sure that she uses a knife this time, which is not almost going to kill you, but will really kill you. Doesn't this sound like something that 2 people who can't find their way around the block would get themselves into? Of course it does. I'm going to pause right here real quick. So the poem, or the story of Romeo and Juliet, most people know the gist of it, but in case you don't, you have 2 teenagers that are from feuding families. And they meet one night at like a masquerade party. They meet and they instantly fall in love. Instantly. But they're sad because they can't be in love with each other. Just, by the way, they're not 30, so they're not supposed to anyway. But they can't because their families are feuding with each other. And Juliet's supposed to marry somebody else, so that's kind of a problem. But they decide that they're in love and they have to be together. And they concoct this big plan. When Juliet's family finds out about it, Romeo is banished. So he can't be in the kingdom at all. There's other things that go on, but that's the basics. So she comes up with a plan that she's going to almost kill herself, take a potion from a medicine person in the town that basically knocks her unconscious. The family will think she's dead. They'll bury her in the family tomb. And then a letter is sent to Romeo about her plan, and he's supposed to come so many days later and rescue her, and then they'll run off together and live happily ever after. Sounds like no problem, right? Problem is, she does this, takes this, people think she's dead, they do the burial thing, and news travels before the letter gets there. So Romeo hears the news that Juliet is dead before he gets the note that explains everything. So he shows up thinking he can't live without this girl he fell in love with one night, whatever. And they're not 30. Anyway, and he actually gets a real legitimate poison, and he wants to go to the grave and at least die next to her. So he goes in there, drinks the poison, starts to die conveniently, just as Juliet's coming out of her, being unconscious thing. And so she wakes up just as he's dying. And she's like, no, you didn't leave me any poison. But she finds there's a knife there. So she's like, I can't live without you. Again, not 30. Not worth it. Okay, anyway, rant over. Takes a knife and says, I can't live without you, and then kills herself next to him. So there they are. The family's going to show up at some point and find both Romeo and Juliet officially dead in the tomb. So that's the story. And Holling's like, it's dumb. I tend to agree. I think it's kind of a dumb story. But shh, don't tell anyone. All right, we're going to keep going. I'm on page 114. So Mrs. Baker doesn't agree. Mrs. Baker couldn't see this problem at all because she's a teacher, and no teacher ever does, except this one. Didn't you find it tragic and beautiful and lovely? She asked me when I told her I finished reading it. See, not really, I said. Well, what did you find it then? Stupid. There we have an opinion that overturns 375 years of critical appreciation. Is there a particular reason you find it stupid? Because they never would have done what they did. Fall in love? All the stuff at the end. The poison and the knife, she said. Yes, they never would have done that. Mrs. Baker considered this for a moment. What would they have done? Gone to Mantua together when Romeo left. He went on. And their parents? Ignored them. Not sure that life is quite as simple as that. These are star-crossed lovers. Their fate is not in their own hands. They have to do what's already been decided for them. That's why it's so tragic and beautiful and lovely. You see, tragic and beautiful and lovely again. Why not just stupid and dumb? Merrilee thought it was wonderful I was reading Romeo and Juliet, since, having been inspired by the Long Island Shakespeare Company's holiday extravaganza, she was reading it too. Don't you think it's romantic, Holling? I guess so. And you're reading it just before Valentine's Day. Yeah. The most romantic day of the year. Don't you love the balcony scene? She clasped her hands and held them under her chin. Oh, Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Merrilee, let's go somewhere for Valentine's Day. I turned around to look at me because somebody else must have said what just popped out of my mouth. What? Said Merrilee. I was still trying to figure out how that popped out. I think there must have been because Mrs. Baker in her Shakespeare is expressing something about what it means to be a human being, and the tragic and beautiful and lovely routine. It all gotten in the air and mixed together, and the first thing you know, after you start breathing that stuff, you say things like what I said to Merrilee. What could I do now? So I said it again. Let's go somewhere together for Valentine's Day. She put her hand on her hip and thought for a minute, then, no, she said. This, in case you're missing it, is the tragic part. Why not? I said. Because you called me a blind mole, and then you acted like a jerk about your father winning the Baker Sporting Emporium contract. That was 3 months ago, and I did not act like a jerk. You still called me a blind mole and hoped, let me see if I can get this right. You hoped that an unwholesome dew from a wicked fen would drop on me. It was actually a wicked dew from an unwholesome fen, but I'm a lot smarter than Romeo, and I know when to shut up. Now here comes the lovely part. Merrily, I said, gag me. There lies more peril in thine eye than 20 of their swords. Look thou but sweet. 20 of whose swords? It's Shakespeare. I said, it doesn't have to make sense. They just have to be words more beautiful than have ever yet been written. So mole and blind are 2 words more beautiful than had ever yet been written. Had I it written, I would tear the word. Merrily smiled. All right, she said, I'll go. I told you it was the lovely part. Even though I still can't figure out how those words popped out of my mouth. That night, I sat through supper trying to decide where I could take Merrily on an allowance that I had to string together for 3 weeks just to get some cream puffs. There was a moment, and this will tell you how desperate I was, when I thought I might ask Mr. Goldman about another play. But it might be Romeo and Juliet, and that would mean more tights. And not for the whole wide world was I going to wear tights again. So I asked my mother, Where could I take someone with $3.78? The supper table quieted. Well, she said, I suppose for an ice cream cone? It's February, I said. Then maybe to Woolworth's for a hamburger and a Coke? Woolworth's? She shrugged. And then to a movie afterward? My mother was not powerful at arithmetic. Who are you taking? Asked my father. Marilee. Marilee who? Marilee Kowalski. Marilee Kowalski, the daughter of Paul Kowalski of Kowalski and Associates? I guess, I said, and he laughed. You better hurry. Why hurry? If Hood and Associates gets the junior high contract, and we intend to, then Kowalski and Associates may very well be no more. And he laughed again. Take her to Woolworth's, said my sister. It's like a hamburger place, like a Steak and Shake. Really? Really. Then she'll know you're a cheapskate and dump you after the first date. If you think that saving someone's life is all it's cracked up to be, and that the savee would swear eternal loyalty and gratitude to the saver, then you don't know the part about how the savee, if she has a picture of her buttocks published in the Hometown Chronicle, has no further obligations to the saver. If my father was sounding more arrogant than usual, it's because he had brought home the scale model of his design for the new junior high school, and he figured it was a winner. And looking at it, sitting on the dining room sideboard where all the silver had been pushed to the edges to make room for it, I thought he might be right. No pillars, he pointed out, no brickwork, no symmetrical layout. Everything was to be new and modern. So there were curved corners and curved walls, and the roof was a string of domes made out of glass, and they arched over the main lobby, the gym, and clusters of science and art classrooms. When I pointed out that the building wasn't square, he pointed out this was 1968 after all, and times were changing. Architecture should change too. He pushed back his chair and walked over to the model and took off its top half. Look at this interior, he said. Open hallways that rise 3 stories to the domes. Every classroom looks into a sunlit space. No one's ever come up with that concept for a junior high school before. Like I told you, it was a winner. But it didn't help me plan a $3.78 evening for Valentine's Day with Marilee. And after supper, while my sister washed and I dried, she was even more helpful than she'd been before. What are you going to give Marilee before you go on your date? She asked. It's not a date, so why should I give her something before we go out? Of course it's a date, and you have to give her something like flowers or candy. Don't you know anything? It's Valentine's Day. I have $3.78. Then buy a rose. Have the florist put a ribbon on it or something. Marilee will figure out you're a cheapskate soon enough anyway. I'm not a cheapskate. I just don't have any money. My sister shrugged. It's the same thing, she said. The next day, I asked Danny where he would take someone if he were going for Valentine's Day. I am going somewhere for Valentine's Day, he said. You are? I'm going out with Mai Tai. You are? I said again. He nodded. Where are you going? To Miller Ridge Inn. Miller Ridge Inn? You have to know that this is the most expensive place to eat you can go on the eastern seaboard. And afterward, my dad's going to drive us to see Camelot. He is? Danny nodded again. Just swell, I said. You know how it's sometimes possible to hate your best friend's guts? I figured by the time Danny was done, he'd spend $17 or $18, and he'd probably buy her a rose too. Toads, beetles, bats. The Wednesday before Valentine's Day, for the cheapskate, Mrs. Baker and I read aloud the last 2 acts of Romeo and Juliet. It was okay, but Romeo still was a jerk. Come, bitter conduct, come, unsavory guide, thou desperate pilot, now at once run on the dashing rocks thy seasick, weary bark. A bark is a boat. Sure, if I was about to die for love, I think I could come up with something better than that. But I guess the rest was all right. Down in the tombs with torches and swords and stuff. Shakespeare needed to get in more of that. By the time we were done, Mrs. Baker was almost in tears. It was all so tragic and beautiful and lovely. You need to see this on the stage, Mr. Hood. It's playing at the Festival Theater on Valentine's Day. Go see it. Now aren't you glad I didn't ask Mr. Goldman about another play? I told you the next one would be Romeo and Juliet. In tights. This is called Foresight, and it probably saved me from more white feathers on my butt. I'm already taking Marilee someplace on Valentine's Day, I told Mrs. Baker. Are you? Where are you taking her? Someplace that costs less than what's left over from $3.78 after you buy a rose with a ribbon on it. That limits you somewhat. My sister says Marilee will think I'm a cheapskate. It's not how much you spend on a lady, said Mrs. Baker. It's how much you give her of yourself. Like Romeo? She nodded. Like Romeo. He didn't end up too well, I pointed out. No, she said, but Juliet never asked for anything but him. So is that what Shakespeare wanted to express about being a human being? That, said Mrs. Baker, may well be a question for your essay examination on Romeo and Juliet. Next Wednesday we'll review and you'll write it for that week after that. No more 150 question tests. You're ready to do more than that. I guess that was good news. On Valentine's Day, Mr. Goreshi announced over the PA that Mrs. Biggio had baked Valentine's Day cupcakes for the junior high, and each class should send out a representative to pick up the class's allotted number of cupcakes at 1 o'clock. I know this doesn't sound like a big deal, but let me tell you, Mrs. Biggio can bake cupcakes. You never want to turn down a Mrs. Biggio cupcake, even if it's all pastel pink with little hearts in the frosting. We thought about cupcakes all day. We even smelled them baking, their beautiful, lovely, cakey aroma wafting down the halls. When the clock clicked to 1:05, Danny gently reminded Mrs. Baker about the cupcakes. He said that he hoped she hadn't forgotten them. Mr. Hupfer, has it been your experience that I have ever forgotten anything? Said Mrs. Baker. Danny had to admit she had never forgot anything. Mrs. Baker looked at her watch. I'm sure that Mrs. Biggio will have made a sufficient number. She went back to reading aloud a tragic love poem by Alfred, Lord Tennyson, who, I guess, couldn't figure out how to punctuate his own name. 1:14. Still waiting for Mrs. Baker to send down a representative for the cupcakes. Up above the asbestos ceiling tiles, Caliban and Sycorax are stirring, probably since the smell of pink icing is now filling the hallways. 1:17. Still waiting. The bulging asbestos ceiling tiles are vibrating. 1:18. Mrs. Baker finally sends me down to Mrs. Biggio. Danny tells me to hurry since he's always hungry. 1:18 and a half. I run in the hallways. Mrs. Biggio was waiting for me with the last tray of Valentine's Day cupcakes. She slid them along the kitchen table toward me, then slid an envelope across as well. Open it, she said. You'll want it for tonight. I opened it. Inside were 2 tickets for Romeo and Juliet at the Festival Theater. Mrs. Biggio, I said, they're season tickets, and I won't be using them tonight, so they'll just go to waste if you don't take them, and the gossip I've picked up is that you could use them, unless you want to be known as a cheapskate. Thank you, I said. I can use them. That night, Mr. Kowalski drove Marilee and me to the Festival Theater to see a production of Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare on Valentine's Day. We sat in 2 seats in the center of the 3rd row. Marilee held the red rose with a ribbon I had bought her. Mr. Goldman played Friar Lawrence and winked at me from the stage. The poisoning, the stabbing scene were okay, but I still think Romeo's a jerk. They needed the ghost of Banquo up there to tell him to lay off the stabbing, or maybe Caliban? But Marilee loved it all. She was sobbing by the time it was over. Wasn't it beautiful? She said as the lights came up. So tragic, I said. That's just the word, she said. We walked through the evening light to Woolworth's, where we sat at the lunch counter, and I ordered 2 Cokes. Let me tell you, it was just swell. We did the balcony scene together as nearly as we could until the guy behind the counter began to look like he wanted us gone. So we ordered 2 more Cokes to make him happy. I still had $1.37 left, and I didn't want Marilee to think I was a cheapskate. Are you going to play a part in another Shakespeare play? Marilee asked. I thought of her sobbing at the end of Romeo and Juliet. Of course, I said. That wasn't even a Presbyterian lie. It was a flat-out lie. But after doing the balcony scene with Marilee, I wasn't going to tell her what a jerk Romeo was. Now, the only way I was going to get back to the Festival Theater stage was, well, there wasn't any other way. Marilee looked at her watch. My father will be here soon, she said. I hope he remembers. I sipped my Coke. I hoped he forgot. All he does is work on the model for the new junior high school. He goes over and over it. He moves a pillar here and then another one there. It's not classical enough, he says. It needs to look like the Capitol building. Classical. When Marilee imitated her father, her eyes got large, her hands went up, and she spoke low. She should be on the Festival Theater stage. Classical, 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 said Marilee. There's hardly another word that comes out of his mouth. My dad doesn't have any pillars, he said. He's got this model all modern. Modern? I nodded. No pillars, no straight walls. So much glass that they'll need 3 Mr. Vinlearys to keep it all clean. That kind of modern. I asked the guy behind the counter for his pencil. He hesitated a second. Since I wasn't since I guess he wasn't so sure about us, but he handed it over and made me promise to give it back. And I drew the glass domes over the main lobby and the gym and the science and art classrooms, and the curved corners and walls and the clusters of classrooms looking out into sunlit space all over my white paper placemat. No one's ever come up with that concept for a junior high school before, I said. Meryl Lee stared at my drawing, then went back to sipping her Coke. Her hair is auburn. Did I tell you that? In the lights of Woolworth's, it shimmered. Mr. Kowalski did remember to come. We finished our Cokes. I handed back the pencil to the guy behind the counter, and Meryl Lee took my placemat as a souvenir. And we walked to the car hand in hand. Mr. Kowalski dropped me off at my house, and I wasn't sure, sitting in the backseat, how to say goodbye to Meryl Lee, but she saved the day. "'Tis almost morning," she said. "I would have thee gone." "Sleep dwell upon thine eyes," I said. I didn't have to look at Mr. Kowalski to know that his eyes were rolling in his head. So that was Valentine's Day. The following week, the school board met to decide on the model for the new junior high school, which was probably why Mr. Kowalski had been spending all his time muttering, "Classical, classical, classical." The meeting was at 4 o'clock in the high school administration building. Mr. Kowalski would present his plan and model, and then my father would present his plan and model, and then the school board would meet in private session to debate whether Kowalski and Associates or Hood and Associates would be the architect for the new junior high school. I know all this because my father was making me come. "It was time I started to learn the business," he said. "I needed to see firsthand how competitive bidding worked. I needed to experience architectural presentations. I needed to see architecture as the blood sport it truly was." Which makes architecture sound like a profession Macbeth would have done pretty well in. The meeting was in the public conference room. And when I got there after school, the school board members were all sitting at the head table, studying folders with architectural bids. Mr. Kowalski and my father were sitting in two of the high school desks, which made the whole thing seem a little weirder than it needed to be. In front of them was a long table with the two models for the new junior high school, each one covered with a white sheet like they were some sort of national secret. I sat behind my father. It was a whole lot of preliminary agenda stuff, old business, procedural decisions, and all that. My father sat through it coolly, occasionally looking at his watch or squaring the edges of his presentation notes. Mr. Kowalski was more nervous. I'm not sure that his cigarette was out of his mouth for more than 3 seconds at a time, back when they still allowed that. "Mr. Kowalski, we're ready for your presentation now," said Mr. Bradbrook, who was the chairman of the school board. He sat at the head of the table, sort of like God would sit if God wore a suit. He was smoking too, but he wasn't working at it as hard as Mr. Kowalski was. "You have 8 minutes," he said. Mr. Kowalski picked up his presentation notes, angled out of his seat, and he went up to the table with the models and stood there for a moment. And then he turned and looked no, not my father, at me. Really. My father looked at him, and he turned and looked at me like I should know what was going on. But I didn't. I just shrugged. 7 minutes, said Mr. Bradbrook. Mr. Kowalski cleared his throat twice. He looked at his design papers, cleared his throat again, and then he looked back at me once more and began. "Gentlemen," he said, "though this is irregular, I've made some significant design changes for the interior of the new junior high since my original submission. In fact, the entire concept has changed markedly. So the plans that you studied for this afternoon's presentations have also changed. I have copies of the new interior plans and ask the board's patience as I show the concept. This may take slightly longer than the allotted time, but I'm sure that the Chamber of Commerce businessman of 1967 won't begrudge Kowalski and Associates a few extra minutes in order to clarify the proposal and to promote the general business atmosphere of the town." "This is irregular," said Mr. Bradbrook. "Has the new concept affected the cost estimates?" "Not significantly," said Mr. Kowalski. Mr. Bradbrook considered. "Well," he said, "if Mr. Hood will agree, then I see nothing wrong with your presentation going slightly longer. Mr. Hood, what could the Chamber of Commerce businessman of 1967 do?" He shrugged and nodded, but the back of his neck grew as red as boiling sin, and I knew he did begrudge the extra time. He begrudged it a whole lot. Mr. Kowalski pulled off the sheet from his model, the new junior high. He cleared his throat again. "As you can see, gentlemen," he said, "the design is quite classical, in the best traditions of our national architecture, for a time when our children desperately need to be reminded of our great American traditions." And it was. It looked like the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Wide steps swooped up past a line of pillars and up to central doors, and above that rose a steep dome with thin windows cut all around it. On either sides of the dome, the building spread graceful wings, all with thin windows again, and behind, the long gymnasium formed the tail, whose rows of bright windows faced south and north to let in as much light as any gymnasium ever could have. "But we live in 1968, gentlemen," Mr. Kowalski said. Just as our children need to be reminded of our great traditions, so too do they need to enjoy the advantages of contemporary technology. I think you'll find the new interior design both modern and innovative, a perfect blend of where we've been and where we're going as a nation. He handed out copies of the plans of the new design to all the school board members, keeping his back to my father and me the whole time. Then he took us through the new interior, slowly. No pillars, no straight walls. The roof, a series of glass plates above the science and art rooms. The central dome 3 stories high over the main lobby, and clusters of classrooms all looking out into sunlit space. All as modern as could be. I don't believe that anyone has come up with this blended concept for a junior high school before, said Mr. Kowalski. And then he sat back down. He never did look over at us. Instead, he lit another cigarette and began pulling at it, shuffled all his papers into a folder. The school board was astounded. 3 of them applauded, not Mr. Bradbrook, since God doesn't applaud. My father turned and looked at me again. His face was very red, and I could tell he was fighting for some kind of control. Hulling, there's something you should have told me, isn't there? He whispered slowly. I looked at him. Do you think this is a game? This is the future of Hood and Associates. Everything rides on this, my future and your future. So what did you do? He used that kind of voice that in my family means that a voice a whole lot louder is about to come along in a minute or two, so you better start preparing. But let me tell you, I didn't really care that much about what he would say or how loudly he would say it. I really didn't. Because suddenly, I knew something a whole lot worse. Romeo was a genius compared to me. I hadn't seen at all what Marilee was doing on Valentine's Day while we were sipping Cokes at the lunch counter at Woolworth's. I hadn't realized how easily she had gotten what she wanted from me. My father's design for the new junior high. Run me on the dashing rocks and hand me a vial of poison. I'm such a jerk, I'd probably drink it. I'm a bigger jerk even than Mickey Mantle. I got up before I began to bawl like a first grader. Hulling, warned my father, slightly louder, in slow whisper. I left the conference room. My red father never did tell me what he did for his presentation. Probably it began with him demanding to see Kowalski's plans, then suggesting he took these from Hood and Associates, not saying it outright, but just suggesting it, like he knew it was the truth but wouldn't say it, and then arguing that Mr. Kowalski should withdraw his proposal because it wasn't the same one he submitted, and now that's not how honest businessmen worked. It would have been something like that, with him getting redder and redder all the time. But if you were watching it, you sure would have seen that architecture is a blood sport, and Macbeth couldn't have played it any bloodier than my father. February is a can't decide what it wants to be month on Long Island. What's left of any snow is melted into brown slush and runs in dirty ridges alongside the street gutters. The grass is dank and dark. Everything is damp, as if the whole island had been dipped under dark water. It was only starting to dry out. Mornings were always gray and cold. And that's what it was like between Marilee and me the next day at school. Slushy, damp, dirty, dark, gray, cold. We didn't look at each other. At lunch, we ate about as far away from each other as we could. She went outside early, even though Marilee hardly ever went outside. She didn't come to chorus, so I sang the soprano part for Miss Violet of the Very Spiky Heels alone at our stand. When Mrs. Baker asked if I'd like to partner with Marilee on the sentence diagramming exercises in the afternoon, I told her I'd rather do it with Doug Swiatek. On Friday, things were still slushy, damp, dirty, dark, and cold. Marilee wore sunglasses to school, even though it was gray like always. When Mrs. Baker asked her to remove from class, she said that her doctor asked her to keep them on, that she was supposed to keep them on for maybe the rest of the school year. I was the only one in the class who didn't laugh at that. I looked out the window. For the next Wednesday, I wrote an essay for Mrs. Baker about what Shakespeare wanted to express about being a human being in Romeo and Juliet. Here's the first sentence of my essay. What Shakespeare wanted to express about being a human being in Romeo and Juliet is that you better be careful who you trust. Here's the last sentence. If Romeo had never met Juliet, he would have been all right. But because he was star-crossed, he did meet her. And because she came up with all sorts of plans that she didn't bother telling him about, he ended up taking poison and dying, which is an important lesson for us to learn in life. Thanks. I had Marilee to thank for this, If she hadn't done what she did, I never would have figured out what Shakespeare was trying to express in Romeo and Juliet about what it means to be a human being. When I handed the essay in, Mrs. Baker read it through. twice. So, she said slowly, do you think Juliet was right to stab herself at the end of the play? Yes, I said. I see, she said. And she put the essay in a manila folder and set it on the top of her desk. But unlike Juliet, Marilee didn't stab herself. In fact, that afternoon she was waiting for me outside the gates of Camillo Junior High, standing beside the ridge of crusted snow she had stamped down flat. It wasn't my fault, she said. Aren't you supposed to be at St. Adalbert's? I just showed him your drawing because it was so good. I didn't know he would use the same design. Sure, Marilee. It's true, she said. All right, it's true. Whatever you say, Marilee. You told him everything about my father's design, everything. And then a few days later, he draws up new plans, so the inside of his school is just like the one of my father's school. You had nothing to do with it. I didn't say I had nothing to do with it, said Marilee. I said I didn't know he would use the same design. I'd keep the dark glasses on, Marilee. It's easier to lie to someone if you can't see their eyes. A long moment went by. Then Marilee took off the glasses and threw them past my head. I think she was trying to throw them at my head. Then she turned and walked away, but not before I saw why she'd been wearing them. I picked up the glasses, put them in my pocket. That night, I saw those glasses flying past my head again and again and again. And I saw Marilee's red eyes again and again and again. Right, you get red eyes from crying a lot. Marilee wasn't in school the next day. I kept looking over at her empty desk. At lunch recess, I wrote a new Romeo and Juliet essay in the library. Here's the first sentence of the essay. What Shakespeare wanted to express about being a human being in Romeo and Juliet is that it's hard to care about two things at the same time, like caring about the Montague family and caring about Juliet too. Because you had the family feud going on, caring about your family, but caring about the new person too. Here's the last sentence. If Romeo had never met Juliet, maybe they both would still have been alive. But what would they have been alive for is the question that Shakespeare wants us to answer. I handed the essay in to Mrs. Baker at the end of the day. She read it through, twice. Then she took my old essay out of the manila folder, which was still on top of her desk, and put in the new essay. She dropped the old essay into the trash and put the folder with the new essay into her desk. And then she looked up at me. So what will you do now? She said. That night, with 79 cents left over from Valentine's Day and $1 from Monday's allowance, I bought 2 Cokes and a rose with a ribbon, and I took them over to Marilee's house and rang the doorbell. Mr. Kowalski answered. You're the hood boy, he said. Is Marilee home? I said. He opened the door further and I came in. He hesitated. Then, her room is the one at the top of the stairs, he said. I went up the stairs slowly. I felt his eyes on my back, but I didn't want to turn around and let him know I felt his eyes on my back. I knocked at Marilee's door. Go away, she said. I knocked again. I heard a chair scrape against the floor and her footsteps stomping across the room. Her door opened. I told you. And then she stopped. Her mouth was open. I thought you might be thirsty, I said. Her mouth was still open. Are you? Am I what? Thirsty? She looked at the Cokes in my hand. Yes, she said. I handed her a bottle and pulled the opener out of my pocket. I love the sound of a brand new bottle of Coke when you pry the lid off and it starts to fizz. Whenever I hear that sound, I think of roses, of sitting together with someone you care about, and of Romeo and Juliet waking up somewhere and saying to each other, weren't we jerks? And having all that be over. That's what I think when I hear the sound of a brand new bottle of Coke being opened. On Thursday, before the school board met to decide on its new architect, Kowalski and Associates withdrew its bid for the new junior high school. Hood and Associates was given the contract. What chumps, said my father. They were going to win, hands down. What chumps? And he shook his head. They're bound to go under now, but if you can't play for keeps, you shouldn't be in business in the first place. And Kowalski never could play for keeps, and Hood and Associates can. And he rubbed his hands together like Shylock on stage, kind of the evil merchant. And that's when something changed. I suddenly wondered if my father was really like Shylock, not because he loved ducats, money, but because maybe he'd become the person that everyone expected him to become. And I wondered if he ever had a choice, or if he ever felt trapped, or if he ever imagined a different life. With this new contract, he's a sure bet for Chamber of Commerce businessman of 1968. It's probably what everyone expected. For the first time, I wondered if it was what he had wanted, or if there was a time when he might have wanted something else. Or if I wanted something else. Or if we were both only fortune's fools, doing what you're supposed to, like Romeo. Marilee and I were partners on Friday for sentence diagramming. We ate together at lunch. We decided to be partners for Mr. Petrelli's next geography assignment, which was the California Gold Rush and you. Make it relevant, said Mr. Petrelli. We sang together in chorus for Miss Violet of the very spiky heels. And when it came time at the end of the day to clean the board, we did that together too. And that's why we were at the board together when Mr. Goreshi came into the classroom to give Mrs. Baker a yellow telegram that she took out of the envelope, then read, then dropped onto the floor as she rushed out, leaving Mr. Goreshi standing in front of the class without any idea what to do. When we picked up the telegram to put on her desk, Marilee and I could hardly not read it ourselves, or at least the words that mattered. Downed helicopter transport, stop. Kisan, stop. Lieutenant T. Baker, missing in action, stop. So there you go, the end of February. So briefly, I'll explain the telegram. They say stop so that you know that the sentence ends. So the announcement is basically Lieutenant Baker, Mrs. Baker's husband, their helicopter was shot down in an area called Kisan, which was a highly, highly violent area in Vietnam. Lots of battles going on there. And he's missing in action now. They don't know where he is. They don't know if he's dead. They don't know if he's captured. They don't know. So she gets a telegram that her husband is nowhere. They don't know. So can't have everything be a happy ending at the end of every chapter. So there you go. February.